Hello, everyone. Very sorry for the slight delay. We had some technical issues that we had to conquer. But I'd like to welcome back again to the studio and critical faculty the magnificent Dr. Robert Price. Hello, Bob. How are you?
Oh, doing great. How about yourself?
Not too bad. Not too bad. Excited about talking about another. I won't call it ambiguous, but we're talking about the apostle of the apostles. And so was she named, but not too many people know too much about Mary Magdalene. And as a matter of fact, the most famous thing about Mary Magdalene, it's a fallacy, or it's a problem or error committed by a certain Pope, Pope Gregory, mistaken her for Mary of Bethany and the unnamed Mary of Luke, the prostitute. And for some reason, in our imagination, when we think of Mary Magdalene, we think about that, the one prostitute who repented and anointed Jesus's feet. What do you think of that? I mean, obviously that is not true, but we can track her all the way, like we've done with Judas Iscariot. We'll start with the name. So you give us a bit of a background about what is Magda or Magdalene.
Yeah, it's often said, partly for ideological reasons, that Magdalene is a patronymic like Jesus of Nazareth, though you remember there's a problem with that, whether that means Jesus, the guy from Nazareth, or Jesus, the member of the sect of the Nazareans. Well, it's the same sort of thing here. There appears to have been a fishing village or city called Magadan or Magdala, which apparently means the tower. And so people reasonably say that that's the origin of it. But this is already ambiguous because it looks like the original reading in Mark's gospel, like as near as we can tell, the original text had where it now says Magdalene or Magadan. It looks like the earliest copies had Dalmanutha, and nobody knows where the heck that would be. So it sounds like that could be some sort of a corruption of something. But they usually like to say, yeah, all right, it has to mean Mary of Magadan or Magdala. And that could be, but I favor the theory of the old rabbis who were like satirizing Jesus and saying, well, he's really, the virgin birth, come on. That's just like, what's her name in the mother of Romulus and Remus. She was a Vestal virgin and suddenly pregnant. She said, oh, well, it's not what you think. It's the god Mars who impregnated me. Yeah, sure. So the rabbi said that his mother Mary was a prostitute and got pregnant by a Roman soldier named Pandera, the Panther, which was a name or nickname of many Roman soldiers. And so they said that Magdalene really comes from an Arabic word which comes across as something like Magdilla, very similar. which would mean literally hair curler or hairdresser. And who got such attention to their hair? Mainly prostitutes, and specifically the madam of a brothel. Ordinary women didn't have the money or the leisure to do that. And you can find elsewhere in the New Testament there is this polemic against women's adornment, that wholesome, upstanding women don't go for having like jewels in their hair and having it curled and styled, very much what the Amish and others do. I mean, they're quoting and obeying those passages. Well, I think that that's very likely right, and that that's where the idea came from in Christian lore, that Mary Magdalene was a reformed prostitute. But it's very difficult to be sure, as with any of these things, because you could, of course, say, well, all right, that is what it means, but it's a slur. That some Christians didn't like her much for some reason, perhaps guilt by association, since there were some Gnostics that claimed that she was the great teacher. And there's a Gospel of Mary, which seems to intend Mary Magdalene. And it's a Gnostic revelation account. And it's similar to saying that 7 demons had been cast out of her.
Mhm.
You wonder, how would you know there were 7? I don't know, but it sounds legendary to me. But there, but you don't have to think very far to say this kind of sounds like just nasty, slanderous polemic, that she teaches doctrines of devils, as one of the pastoral epistles says about heretics. So demon possessed. She's teaching, she's misleading the brethren to adultery, like in the Old Testament, meaning idolatry. That you're betrothed to the one God of Israel, but here you are going out shacking up with Baal and so forth. So it could mean that, like Jezebel in the book of Revelation, whoever that actually was, she entices my servants and goes to bed with them and so forth. It's hard to know whether this is just a mudslinging thing, which was common in the ancient world. It's like when Paul in Galatians says these guys that are advocating Gentile circumcision, why don't they go the whole way and chop the whole thing off? This is not exactly tactful dialogue, but that's the way it was in the ancient world. So, in other words, it could be that her title, her epithet, means Mary the prostitute. But and that could mean, what a catch that Christ was able to get even somebody like this to repent. Maybe they'd still know her as that, meaning the former prostitute. But it's really impossible to tell. All of those options are quite plausible. But as you mentioned before, she's sometimes called the apostle to the apostles, because in the Gospel of John, she goes to the disciples and says, "Hey, the tomb is empty, and
Mhm.
I've seen angels there." And then, of course, she sees Jesus himself. Well, they think she's crazy, and they go to the empty tomb and they say, well, "What is going on here? What's happened?" And in Luke, they say, "You're crazy." Same thing; they just dismiss it. Uh, in Mark, they're told by a young man to go tell the disciples that Jesus is risen, but they don't. In Matthew, they see Jesus himself and are told to tell the disciples, and they do, and they go to the mountain Jesus directed them to in Galilee. So what even happened? It's like Mark left it hanging, and different people are trying to finish it up in the way they think best, and they didn't conspire, they didn't confer about it. Now, and then one last thing that makes some difference. the women at the tomb are not mentioned at all in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 11, which is that list. First, he appeared to Peter, Cephas, and the 12, James, and all the apostles, etc., etc. And finally, to me, it doesn't mention women. Why not? And there are possible reasons for that. Traditionally, they say, well, that's regrettable chauvinism that was rampant in that day. And they didn't think the women were worthy and credible witnesses, or that nobody else would think they were. So they left it out. Could be, but I tend to think it's a reflection of this Gnostic claim that Mary taught Gnosticism, which she does in the Gospel of Mary. And if you look close at John chapter 20, when she finally does see Jesus, she thinks it's the gardener who has reburied the body of Jesus somewhere. She says, "Sir, if you know where they reburied him, let me know so I can go there." And he says, "Mary," and she recognizes Jesus. And what does he say to her? "Don't touch me. I've not yet ascended to my Father," but which is probably borrowed from the ascension of the angel Raphael in the book of Tobit. But at any rate, what does he tell her to do? He says, he doesn't say, "Go and tell my brethren to meet me in Galilee," like in Matthew and Mark. No, he says, "Tell them goodbye." He says, "Tell them that I am ascending to my Father and your Father." Well, surely, I mean, you can tell that it doesn't fit the context, that a bunch of episodes have been strung together and they don't really fit even in John. And this one seems originally to have ended on that note, that for their faith in the resurrection, they were dependent on what Mary, the only witness of the resurrection, had to say. And that's then you're really asking for polemics. People are going to start making rival claims. "Oh yeah, I saw Jesus and he told me so and so." Did you really? Well, who knows? There's no way to evaluate any of those claims. But Gnostics did say that that Mary Magdalene was their teacher, and the Gospel of Mary is at least one witness to that. So who knows what finally happened? But she was considered by some the greatest of the apostles. And she's called that in several Gnostic texts, like in the Gospel of Philip. The disciples noticed that Jesus loved Mary more than them and often used to kiss her on the lips.
On the mouth. Yeah.
"Why do you love her more than us?" And Jesus says, "Well, what you really ought to be asking is, why do I not love you as much as I love her?" And it's because she's the most advanced. And in the Pistis Sophia, she's asking all these questions of the risen Jesus. And Peter says, "Tell this broad to shut up. None of us can get a question in edgewise." He said, "Well, that's because she's the woman that knows the all, or all things possibly." So these Gnostics figured, yeah, she was a greater apostle and understood everything better than these clowns.
But Bob, don't you think here there is a certain theme, and I keep getting this theme in my head. When you have certain the first three gospels, which are sort of more sort of narrative, more historical, sort of mentioning facts, you don't get into sort of theology until you get to John, and then the story is told in a slightly different way. And because it's John, he's framing himself, is highlighting himself to be something a little bit special, something a little bit extra. And you get that with the Gospel of Judas, and you get that with every single individual gospel from that point on, of those who are claiming, obviously on their name, because I don't think Mary wrote that gospel or even Judas, but somebody believed that these side characters were a lot bigger than what they were. It's like watching a movie, and most of us are focused on the central figures, the heroes of the movie. And there are certain French people who are always sort of associate with those side characters. You know, they don't seem to have as much limelight, but for some reason, they think they have a lot more significance. There is a reason. Maybe they connect with a 5 minute scene and they go, oh, this person has got a lot more. Without that person, the whole thing would collapse. And they'll end up identifying. Maybe they are similar to them, so they identify with them, and then they start writing a spin off part two of that movie where that side character becomes a central figure. What do you think of that narrative?
Yeah, that happens, and sometimes extra figures are just dropped. There are medieval stories of Jesus and Peter traveling around and meeting people, and little interesting anecdotes. What happened to all the other ones? Well, they didn't really need them. You just needed, I mean, Peter is obviously the most prominent in the Gospels too. He just sort of is the voice of all the disciples. You really hear nothing about all of the others, really. And so they just dropped them later. This is kind of like, as you know, I'm a big fan of comic books and pulp fiction and all that. In the great pulp novels of Doc Savage, who is this guy, he's like athletically developed. He's a genius, a scientist. He has every possible skill, and then he has this amazing crew of these five guys, each of whom is a specialist in some scientific thing, and so they're his assistants. But you don't really need them if you got Doc. And eventually, in the stories, there are like 180 of these novels. And eventually it kind of narrows down to just Doc Savage and his straight man, Monk, something or other, his big muscle guy who is very smart but funny and comical. The authors decide, what do we need the other ones for? Let's just have Doc Savage and Monk. It's the same logic. You don't need them. You don't want to take the time to make stories about the others. You want to keep the focus on them. And then sometimes a new character assumes center stage. The spotlight's on him, whereas originally it was somebody else. Well, the storytellers change him, and this happens in the Pentateuch a good bit, where Moses wasn't original to the story. The heroes were either the elders of Egypt, of Israel in Egypt. And in fact, they're the ones who have the first meeting with Pharaoh, not Moses. Moses and Aaron are waiting outside reading the magazines. Okay, guys, how did it go? And then after that, they're shoved to the side. And you have Nadab and Abihu, these priests who seem to have been the heroes who met God face to face. But once you got Moses, they're still in the story, but they're just luggage, really. They have no independent, they just hang on, part of the retinue. Then Aaron gets added, and he begins to push Moses to the side. There's several of the episodes where it's Aaron who brings the plague on Egypt, not Moses. This is what I call the redundancy principle. And you can kind of see this. Why is this character still in here? This secondary character? Well, because he wasn't the secondary character originally, but they can't just kick him out. And you do see literary variations that way, and that explains some of this stuff. These holy women who are named, but we hear nothing about them. Well, originally you probably did. And with one or two of them, you can reconstruct it. Like with Joanna, who appears in the female retinue of Jesus. She's only in Luke. But there are little clues. It says that she was the apparently estranged wife of Chusa, who was a friend of Herod Antipas and was following Jesus around instead of staying home. Well, there's a story there, and we can connect the dots. I won't take time to bore you stiff with it, but there obviously was more about Mary Magdalene. And it's quite possible that Gnostics have retained more of that and kept her and replaced Peter with her. So she's the apostle of the apostles, and Peter is just a whining crybaby in these. So it's funny. There's literary dynamics, there's theological ones, and
That's
they're different because the stories were edited differently.
Yeah, I recall from the Gospel of Philip. I think Peter was the one with the most issue with Mary Magdalene because of her, her sex first, and her that she was receiving a lot more love from Jesus. Mary Magdalene's significance, regardless of where the by name is from, I lean towards the place of birth, because it was not common until the Pope Gregory's blunder, mistaking her for a couple of other Marys, or even the prostitute in Jesus' narrative wasn't even named. I think in the Bible, Gospel of Luke. So apart from the name, there's a huge significance here. It's the role of a female in divinity. Whether only men can be the hands of God and women are there just to obey and observe and serve, or can women take active part in the church and in the preaching and in the helping of the divine plan of God? And it seems that the four main gospels, she's just there as a tribute to show that Jesus loved everyone, including women, and women had to figure somehow. But in her Bible, I think in the Gospel of Thomas, Philip, and Mary, these are Gnostic Gospels. She plays a lot bigger role, and signifies that women are not just there to serve and play a sort of an aiding act. They're there. They can do the will of God. They can be prophets in their own right. How do you see that bit?
Oh yeah, I really think that's correct. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza has written a bunch of books. The only one I've really read was the first one. Well, actually, her first one was a commentary on Revelation, but she got famous for a book called In Memory of Her. And you think, what? In memory of Jesus, right? Well, no, she's taken this from the anointing story. Wherever this gospel is preached, this will be told in memory of her. And she argues that there are signs in these stories of an earlier version where women really did have a role to play. And she speaks of a discipleship of equals. Now, that, did anybody ever say that before Christian feminism came along? You have to suspect things like that initially. It's just manipulated for a cause celeb. But I think she's right. I think sometimes you just don't see things in history until they become an issue, and then you say, "Oh, now I see the importance of that." Well, that's what I think happened, because in my dissertation, The Widow Traditions in Luke Acts, I said, I think Schussler Fiorenza could have said a lot more. And I went through Luke and Acts and showed how they're plain signs of Luke, to call him that, whatever his name was, had taken stories where the women had a prominent role as prophets and so forth, and cut them down to size. Like he makes a big deal in Acts 20, I think, that Paul and the others went to wherever, where Philip had settled with his four daughters who were prophesying virgins. Well, that's interesting. It's like we're going to see them do something, right? And the next thing that happens is Agabus, a male prophet from earlier in the story, is suddenly here. And he's the one that gives the prophecy that we're leading up to, that Paul is really doomed if he goes to Jerusalem. And so it's so obvious what happened. Or in the beginning of Luke, Anna, the prophetess who's over 100 years old, has been living in the temple, expecting the kingdom of God. And that's it for her. Simeon comes up and gives one of the long prophetic songs. Oh, come on. Obviously, it was originally Anna who did that, but she's still on stage, but she's just been shoved out of the spotlight. And they left obvious traces of this. And I will go into story after story. And it's not as if we can only infer this. We know that from Tertullian and others that Marcionites and Gnostics and others were notorious for having women having like a rotating MC of their meetings who could baptize and catechize and do evangelism. And Tertullian and others are saying, oh, no, we got to put a stop to that. Even in First and Second Timothy and Titus, there are orders of consecrated widows who are stipended by the church, and the author says, okay, from now on, it's just going to be an old folks thing, a relief order, and that's it. Don't let them do any ministry because they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, after all, it was Eve who was gullible enough to be deceived by the devil, so they will be too. Really, tell them to shut up and stay in the kitchen, and they'll be saved through childbearing. I remember I read that once when I was right on the edge of jumping the evangelical ship. And I looked up from it and I said, this is bullshit. And I thought, inspiration, come on, forget it. And that was really the straw that broke the camel's back. But that's what was going on. There's this layer of repression of women. And Schussler, it wouldn't be that way if Schussler Fiorenza were not correct. And this is what happens sociologically with new religious movements. They start out being egalitarian. They're against the elitism of an ecclesiastical establishment. Oh, no bishops and stuff for us, like the Quakers and the Plymouth Brethren, no clergy, though eventually they start creeping in again, or the Pentecostals at the turn of the 20th century. They had women prophesying and doing anything men could do. They were interracial, famously. It just didn't matter. We've all got the Holy Spirit. But as time went by, that changed. And it seems to happen in sectarian movements as they start in the second generation to assimilate back to the values of the larger mainstream culture. And that's happened in Christianity clearly. And Mary Magdalene, I think, is a casualty of that.
I think this is a human phenomena. Even George Orwell in Animal Farm, I think he it said that things starts with very good will and intentions and eventually end up being something completely different. I think it even surpasses religion. It happens in politics. It happens in all sort of human endeavors. Once you have too many fingers in the pie and too many scheming and plans, they end up with all these sort of different variations of what maybe started as something good or something, beneficial. But going back to her story is quite interesting to me. Her first introduction was more of something that happened in the past. They didn't talk about her demon possession in real time, like Jesus going there and there's a struggle going on, and like the one with the herd of swine, it was like a real time action. This one here is passed on as a bygoner, and it was a way of introduction to her. And how she made it into the folds of of the disciples and Jesus casually. The number 7, I guess it's the divine number, so it had to be either 7 or 12. These numbers have interesting stories behind them. But that's the first introduction of her. And then we end up of her, I think, in the Bible, in the Gospel of, can't remember whether it's, I think it might have been Mark, where she was running errands for the apostles, and she perceived to be a bit wealthy because she could travel with them. She's obviously
I think that's Luke chapter 9, where it says that there were these well-to-do women who followed them and paid their expenses.
Yeah, agreed. So she can travel around with them. She's obviously has some sort of maybe inherited some money. We don't know. There isn't too much limelight on her. But one thing we know for sure, she's always there, while the men are always sort of scared when the tough gets going and the going get tough. Women are always in the forefront, including Mary Magdalene at the crucifixion, the empty tomb scene. She's always there, lurking about. Showing no fear, showing no worry, always there. While some men are just running around either scared or in denial or not sure if this is really Jesus or not. She seems to be always lurking about in kind of their calm and collected and assured footings. What do you think of that?
Well, that's a little psychologizing of the text. Like we have to sort of read her motivations from her actions. That's always the case in narratives. But I guess the idea of the sevenfold exorcism may be an attempt to explain that she owed Jesus a great debt. What sort of hell would she have lived in if she's that schizophrenic, basically? But now she's not. Oh, naturally, you're going to be pretty grateful. And in the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, where Paul and the others collect a following of female disciples because they're preaching encretism, the celibacy gospel. You've got to renounce sex even if you're married or you can't be saved. Well, women hear this and they leave their husbands and fiancés and so on, who are pretty steamed about it, and they go to highly placed contacts of these jilted men. And the men go there and they say, look, Your Highness, I've got this problem. Maybe you can help me with. My wife has gone off with this guy who must be a gigolo. He's probably screwing her, but he's, some kind of a guru. He's a homewrecker. Can't you do? And my wife's not the only one. Can't you do anything about this guy? And so, all right. Well, I think that in Luke, it's partly dependent on one of these stories in which Jesus played the role of the preacher of the celibacy gospel. And that's why Joanna and the other women are following him. And we're told explicitly that Joanna left her husband, who was an administrator, an old pal of Herod Antipas. And we also hear only in this gospel that Herod Antipas wants to kill Jesus. Why? Right? The Pharisees come to him and say, you better get out of here. Herod Antipas is gunning for you. And well, why? Well, that makes perfect sense if he has alienated his friend's wife from him. And so she becomes a Jesus groupie. And presumably the same thing happened with the other ones. Mary Magdalene, if the harlot thing is right, it's slightly different, but the demon possession would fill the blank as to what she owes to Jesus. So we're sort of invited to make connections like this. And whereas the what did Jesus do for the men? He told them to walk off their jobs and leave their families. That they might not have considered that much of a favor, but I guess they were banking on having the chief seats at the marriage supper of the Lamb once Jesus kicked Roman butt in Jerusalem. And so maybe that's why they were loyal, which means they weren't that loyal. But instead of an anticipation of the future, so that this was an investment of time, the women disciples were grateful for what Jesus had done for them in the past. I never really thought of it that way, but that's certainly what's going on. He's not promising the women to sit at his right and left hand or anything. So it is a definite portrayal of a very different psychology of the male and the female disciples.
Yeah. Now we go to that blunder of Pope Gregory, I think in 591, where I think he was given a sermon and he mistaken Mary Magdalene for the unnamed prostitute and a bit of Mary Bethany. And from that point on, this idea caught on, and it seems to be a bit romantic. It's almost like the story of the movie Pretty Woman by Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. There's something romantic about falling in love with somebody who's sinful, and because of the power of love, it purifies the heart, and it's all platonic again. It's all beautiful and almost like a virgin-like sort of love, and it sounds really wonderful. So I think it might have gone on because this is like a big sin, and you get away from that and you go back to Jesus, and it shows as a symbolic story that it doesn't matter how much you stray. There's always a place for you in the kingdom of heaven if you truly repent. So I think the story has some symbolic significance if it was true. The problem was that, and I think it was corrected in only 1969 by Paul VI, Pope, that she is different. Mary Magdalene is different than the prostitute, and she should not be confused or conflated with the other stories here. You tend to think, okay, well, if Magdalene means the hair curler, and that can be to do with the profession, because in previous episodes, we've agreed that people will have the by name based on three criteria: either the place of birth, a profession, or maybe a deformation or an illness. And that surely fits the category number 2, which is a profession. But it seems to be more linked to men rather than women. And so I lean towards the place of birth. And therefore, if she was not the prostitute that the gospel was talking about, then she's grateful through the story of the demonic position, which I think the number 7 is the number of perfection. And number 7 means, in some terms, overwhelmed. There's so many are completely taken by demonic position to the point of perfection. Holy was taken. So I think the number 7 has some magical numbers, like of the addition of a triangle and a square and geometric shapes that will give you perfection in terms of any analogy you're trying to draw.
Yeah, so it has to be. I mean, otherwise, why is it recurrent like that in all sorts of contexts?
Yes.
Though I'm not sure the Pope wasn't right about this, because there's this fascinating analysis of all the anointing stories, which have differences. Was Jesus' hair anointed, or was it his feet, and who was it, and so on? He throws in also the woman taken in adultery, and even Lazarus and the rich man. And you could do a diagram, somebody did, where you see what elements came from where, and it kind of looks like that there were like a couple of stories that got garbled. Well, I don't want to say that that got rewritten in oral tradition, and that it might actually be that there was just a single original story of a woman uh, uh, who was a big fan of Jesus, who was a believer for whatever reason, exorcism or repentance or whatever, and that it got spun out, and that's in different ways to make slightly different points. On the other hand, Mary was an extremely common name. From
Yeah.
what we know about name statistics, half the women in
Hmm.
Palestine at this time were named either Mary or Mariam, or the different versions, or Salome, because these two names were prominent in the royal family of the Herods, and so everybody was naming their kids this. So it's not odd that there are a whole lot of Marys. That's quite plausible. But there is reason to suspect that these are different versions of the same original story, in which case you could say, in a sense, they are all Mary Magdalene. But
Yeah. It just for me, if a story emerges at the year 591 and it doesn't have much of a trace before, and it appears for the first time way later than the event, to me, just based on historical criteria, I would go, maybe this is just someone's reading of the situation, or because the way it was portrayed, the way I read about it, it was actually just he was just confused about it. He didn't have, it wasn't anchored on theological explanation. He didn't come forth and he said, by the way, Mary Magdalene, and she is the unnamed woman. And he didn't sort of back it up. It came in a sermon, and he seemed to just sort of confused it without any backing up of the theology why he thinks so. That's why I feel it might be one of those things. But again, I'm open-minded to both elements. And before we go to that next portion, Bob, there's a question here from Sue. Thank you, Sue, very much for the super chat. Is it true that the Germanic prophetess Veleda, who was captured by the Romans and kept in a tower, was also turned into a Vestal virgin? You aware of
I
that?
have no idea. I've never heard that before. It's
Same
fascinating.
here. Same
Yeah,
here. But
I'll have to look it up. Sounds
interesting.
interesting.
So, I mean, if this
Yeah.
story is true, I mean, there is some fascination with virginity, and even people can transform back to being virgins as if it's the height of purity. Obviously, the mother of God had to be virgin. You know,
Hmm.
there was always a high evaluation on women's virginity to be sacred or to be something divine, as if sex was dirty. It was still perceived to be that way. And then will take us actually very nicely to the next bit of the story. Jesus never married, according to all of the Gospels or the narrations. His sexuality was never really sort of highlighted. He's kind of God. He's supposed to be kind of sexless almost, even though he's in the image of a man, but he doesn't act just necessarily like a man. He's acting as a spirit who's supposed to be genderless, so sexuality doesn't really come to be evaluated here. Rather than it's a sacred steps towards enlightenment, towards getting closer to God. However, with the introduction of all these different variations, and we find in the Gospel of Philip, his story about him and Mary Magdalene being so close to each other, and he was his most beloved disciple, to the point where he used to kiss her on the mouth. And it led to, obviously, Dan Brown's notorious story about the Roseline, or the Rosalind, or the Sangre Royale, the royal blood. They fled to France, and they lived there. Funny, they call it Sangre Royale, which means royal blood and not divine blood. So I think it's derived from being a king rather than a god.
Mhm.
The Jews sort of thing. How plausible is this even possible that he would have had a
Then,
relationship
well,
with Mary
Martin
Magdalene?
Luther thought that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. I mean, he's, of course, if you're a Catholic, he's a heretic anyway, but he figured that, and that may have had something to do with the fact that he had been a monk, but sort of abolished monasticism within Protestantism and married an ex-nun, Kate somebody or other, and maybe he needed the precedent of Jesus, but well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, he picked up on hints like people do today. Like for instance, whose wedding was Jesus attending at Cana? How about his own? That's kind of interesting. I mean, who knows? But it does make you think. And Jesus seems to be in charge. There are little hints like that. But what my problem with Dan Brown, well, I have literary problems with him, but he has this idea that the horror it would pose theologically if we found out that Jesus begat children and was married, because then he wouldn't be God. He doesn't know what he's talking about. According to Orthodox Christian theology, Jesus was completely human in every way, and he was fully God, and that's the holy mystery. They don't pretend to be able to explain it like on a chalkboard. And so that Jesus certainly could have fathered children. And if you say, well, if he did, what would they be, like one quarter divine? Uh, Good question, but that doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, if you say it would debunk his divinity, you're a heretic. That's the problem. You're a docetist saying Jesus wasn't really human. He just looked like it. Well, if that's what you want to believe, that's fine. You wouldn't be the only person that did, but that doesn't disturb Orthodox traditional Christianity. It raises an interesting conundrum, but so what? There's no problem if you found out Jesus was married and had children. That wouldn't disturb the Nicene Creed or anything like that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, but if you take his divinity away and portray him as somebody who thought that he was the Messiah, and people who believe around him believed he was the Messiah, because there is variations of Christianity where Jesus isn't sort of divine, more of a prophet, the Islamic version of it. There are people who believed he was very, very high in sort of in God's regard, but he wasn't a god. Even in the Nicene Creed was still arguing whether not he's God or not, but whether he was co-eternal or with God the Father or not. But if he was just a normal person who believed to be all these things, and people around him to believe that he was a divine being, but he wasn't, and he fell in love with somebody who got married, then there could be an offspring and a line of Jesus's, but they will be normal people just like you and me. I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. If the historical Jesus existed and he wasn't God and he wasn't homosexual, because that's another thing that has been sort of alluded to, that especially in the, I think, Gospel of John, there are some hints that people thought maybe he was homosexual. What do you think of that, man? Do you think there are some hinting?
I don't really, because I think that's based on the beloved disciple, and that said he was in the bosom of Jesus. Well,
Yeah.
earlier in the same book, it says that Jesus was in the bosom of the Father, and therefore really knew he was a confidant, and therefore he's the one to tell you the religious truth. And in the same way, the beloved disciple is a kind of a fictive character who is the mouthpiece for the ascended Jesus, and he's telling you the real stuff. He's the paraclete in person. And so he is next to Jesus at the Last Supper, and you can't ask a question of Jesus without going through uh, um, the beloved disciple. It's like a parallel. I think it is simply theological. It means his favorite disciple. In fact,
Yeah.
as Richard Carrier points out, Joseph of Arimathea may break down into the same thing. The guy from best disciple town, and that's not impossible or implausible. And so it needn't mean I mean, like with Lazarus, look how he loved him. That didn't mean they used to go out on dates together. I mean, I love my friends and I'll tell them so, but it doesn't mean I want to hop into the sack with them. And so there, but people are reading, like sometimes they're thinking of, what is it, David and, oh, good God, Jonathan, Saul's son, who were really comrades in arms and so on. And David says to Jonathan at one point, "My love for you is greater than that of a man for a woman." That could mean they were gay, which wouldn't be historically implausible because it would mean they're like Achilles and Patroclus, for instance.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, it can mean like what Hellenistic writers like Plutarch, I think, said that a man has a kind of relationship with a male comrade that he'll never have with his wife. And it could, what David said could mean that is, look at his wives in the story. He's not too close to any of them. And so it's hard to say. It wouldn't be surprising. I'm not against the idea. I don't find it distasteful, but you really have to ask, do you have sufficient evidence? Or if you don't, it's just an interesting speculation. And so many of these things are. Every theory of mine is a speculation. I don't claim any more for it because in
Yeah.
the nature of the case, there's not enough evidence.
He could have also been bisexual. He could have. We don't
Anything.
know. Yeah. And I think in the Greek culture as well, that sort of thing. You could be married with wife, and you have a male sort of partner. It was sort of prevalent around that time. But all what we're going to be doing right now is speculating because we won't be able to know for sure. But the one thing about, if we go back to Mary Magdalene, is a very interesting the concept behind her, and that can lead sort of feminism at this point. Are women, and this is something that we can maybe need to go back into the antiquity and understand the position of women in Judea. Because there are conflating information here. Some people say, well, women had absolutely no rights whatsoever. They can bear no witness. They are very belittled. And that's why it made the story of them being in the forefront of the telling of the news, like the empty tomb. And I said, well, if you really think the Bible is orchestrated and made up, why would you write it in a way to have people with less credibility witnessing most things? If you're doing this from scratch, you'll have males doing that because then you have confidence that this has happened. But the fact that they've actually mentioned females to be the main witnessing of all the major acts, it's telling me that this is genuine because they could have opted, if this whole thing was fake, they would choose to have very famous, honorable people, male mainly, witnessing these main acts, therefore a lot more credibility.
Well, that is true. And in fact, apologists used to, well, still do, I guess, say that, you see, this must be true because women were generally not held to be credible witnesses in courts of law. So for them to include this, it must have been true. I don't see how that follows, for one thing, but women were, in fact, considered to be credible witnesses in the areas where they were dominant, like preparing the dead for burial and mourning. You wouldn't, if you were trying to find out if something about somebody's funeral, you'd ask the women, not the men. That even shows up in the Gospels where Jesus says, "You're like boys and girls in the marketplace that can't decide on a common game to play." The boys say, "We wanted to dance. What's the matter with you?" And they say, "Oh, we want to mourn." Well, in other words, they want to imitate what they see adults of their sex doing, because the men dance together at weddings. Um, and the women did all the mourning and so forth and the wailing at funerals. And so it started real early. But because of that, the women would be the witnesses you would want. And what would the men be doing there? They would ask. Now, but there's another reason that I think is even more important, that these resurrection empty tomb stories are of a piece with the similar stories of Osiris, Attis, Adonis, and various other dying and rising gods, Baal, Tammuz, where the god is defeated and dies, and the consort or wife or sister or two of those together, they decide, I'm not going to let this go. I am going to find him in the realm of the dead and bring him back. And so you have the holy women, even the divine women, seeking out the dead god and bringing him back. In the case, for instance, of Isis and Nephthys resurrecting Osiris, how does Isis do it? By anointing him with a special oil. What is it that the women wanted to do at the tomb of Jesus? Not just put flowers there, they wanted to anoint the body. My guess is originally the way that story came out is they did anoint it, and that brought Jesus back to life. I mentioned this in a couple of my books, and that all of this came to the writers through the women's mourning cults that like in Egypt, every spring they reenacted the death, burial, and resurrection of Osiris, with women taking the role of the goddesses, and passion plays, and the Attis thing, they did that too. They would strip the branches and bark off a pine tree and tie a clay human form to it, and this would be the crucifixion of Attis. They would stick it in a hole in the wall for 3 days, then bring it out and say, "Rejoice, for your God is saved, and we too will be saved from ills." I mean, it's the pattern that you see again and again from the cultic mourning of the holy women in this particular kind of redemption myth. And I think that's really Occam's
So, Bob,
razor. If you got that, you don't need any other explanation.
do you think then, obviously, given the timeline of the writings, and we're going to get to a question very soon here that I got on the screen, um, we know that the even before the Gospels, the letters of Paul were predate the four Gospels, and I
Maybe.
think it was sort of the around the year 20. Let's say, I mean, yeah, for argument's sake, let's say it was the year 20, and I think the nearest Gospel would have been about the year 25 or so.
Oh,
Um,
I'm
uh,
not likely. Even
yeah,
conservatives say that the earliest gospel would probably be around
45,
70. I
70.
think
Wow.
it's like 120. But even conservative apologists will say Mark, the first one, must have been written around 70.
Right. So maybe then, would it be then safe to say that the very early stories about these were oral traditions, mostly
Mhm.
distributed by women and circulated through women?
Yes, that's what I think. Yeah.
And we understand. So these are women. They are. There's a lot more sort of emphasis on the emotional bits of the story. They are if they're not working, they probably will have a lot more time for storytelling and tell each other and the neighbors and the house next door and the story. And then once all the females sort of have all the stories sort of circulated. It goes into the families, the males. The male will take these stories, and for the first time, they will write them down. But the original story comes from oral traditions distributed by women who might have revived Jesus in the act of anointment because he wasn't truly dead. Maybe he was
Well, that's possible too.
unconscious, like he was completely weak. He looked like he was dead, but he wasn't. And through the act of anointment, something happened. And like people who sort of they think they're dead, and the what do you call them? The dead ringers, where they used to have a bell at the end of a coffin, because just in case somebody wakes up in the middle of the night and says, "Hey, I'm not dead."
You're not fooling anyone.
So it's very plausible. It could have happened.
Yeah, that certainly could have. Yeah, I mean, people getting buried alive happens so frequently that surviving medical texts from this period tell the doctor how to be sure they're dead, because this happened too often. And that's why we have several different stories of the physician Asclepiades, and various other famous characters who didn't raise the dead, but they intervened at the last moment in a funeral they happened to see, just like in Luke with the widow of Nain's son. And they say, "Wait a minute, are you sure they're dead? Let me take a close look." And in one of them, it says he was able to discern a slight puff of breath that others couldn't. And they said, "Look, this guy's not dead." And there were several stories. I collected a bunch of them in one of my books, so that even in the Gospels, Jairus's daughter and the son of the widow of Nain, and even Lazarus, you got to wonder if originally the story was that Jesus saved the poor person from premature burial, because that's the way all these other stories were. I mean, they say,
so we're talking maybe about
talking
about. Yeah, so we're probably talking about like acts of resuscitation in sort of ancient way. Yeah, very interesting. So the questions I've got here, and I don't know the answer. I'm not familiar with Marcus Vincent. Is Dr. Price aware of Marcus Vincent's theory about 1 Corinthians 14:34? If so, what does he think of it?
1434. Where did I put that New Testament I had right here? Oh, what does it say? Okay, let me grab this one. Yeah, I love his work on Marcion and the dating of the Gospels. So this is 1 Corinthians 14.
1 Corinthians 14:34. I'm gonna.
Oh yeah, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silence in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as even the law says. If there's anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. And that's one of those things where it's like from a late New Testament writing, and this is like trying to squelch a freedom that women had. That no, they can't speak, they can't prophesy like they used to, and earlier in a different section of the composite. 1 Corinthians. No, tell them to keep quiet. If they have any questions, wait till you get home and ask your husband. Surely he knows. And it seems to contradict earlier in the book where it says, well, women can pray and prophesy in public as long as they have a symbol of divine authority on their head. But this is pretty awful in my opinion. And it says, even as the law says, there's been a lot of research done on that. There's nothing to this effect in the Old Testament. I mean, I'm not sure which males would be speaking in the temple, or but the priests, the Levites, maybe. But what's he talking about? There is no Old Testament law that prevents women from speaking. So, that implies this is written by somebody that didn't really know their Old Testament law.
It seems to be between the era of sort of the very early church and to the blunder, as they say, of Pope Gregory, mistaking Mary Magdalene for Mary Bethany and the unnamed woman, that there's been a development of animosity towards women, or at least male. The male figures want to take charge. They want to be. They almost like sort of dreaded the fact that the early stories were circulated by women, and maybe they feel lift out of the story sometimes, that they should have been in the front foot in terms of witnessing the crucifixion and the empty tomb. And that developed.
That's explicit in the Gospel of Mary, I think, where
Yeah.
she says, "Oh, he appeared to me," and so on. And Andrew or Peter, one of them, says, "What, are we supposed to believe that he appeared to a woman and not us?" Sheesh. I mean, it's exactly what you said. They don't
Yeah.
like being left out.
To the point where in my reading it says when the early churches, when they were start talking about Mary Magdalene, they'll brush over her really quickly, and some call her, I think, a hysterical woman.
Yeah,
Like
Celsus says that. Who
correct.
saw this? Some hysterical woman?
Yeah, obviously, because so they're maybe they don't need Mary Magdalene as such, not as an individual, but it was a movement towards, okay, we are men, we are in the hands of God, we are all the prophets according to the biblical tradition have been male, so we carry the torch. The females are there to support us. We are the supporting acts. They shouldn't lead. So, do you think Paul's utterings here, first of all, is it one of the forged writings of Paul, or this is legit?
I think that even if Paul wrote most of the texts of the 7 big epistles that most critical scholars accept, I don't, but they do. Even if you think he wrote most of that stuff, this appears to be an interpolation, because it contradicts what is said earlier in the same book, and not only at this point. And Winsome Monroe, a brilliant New Testament scholar, she wrote this book called Authority in Paul and Peter. And it's about isolating a whole chain of interpolations in First Peter and the so-called Pauline epistles, where there's all this attempt to make to defuse the charismatic radicalism of early Christianity represented in Paul from a later standpoint. So all this wives, obey your husbands, and be subservient to the government, and all this. She says you can tell by differences in vocabulary, interruptions in the flow of the argument, and various criteria. I mean, she really does an intricate job of this, that these things were all by the same hand and not Paul or Peter or whoever wrote that. This is because these works were inspired. Well, the big 7 at least were Marcionite texts first, and they found they couldn't compete with Marcion just having an Old Testament. Marcion had a New Testament with the 1 gospel and 10 epistles, and this was going over like gangbusters. And Polycarp and others in the emerging Catholic Church said, look, we got to try to co-opt this. And it's not a bad idea to have a Christian scripture alongside the Old Testament. We're not getting rid of the Old, but let's keep it and add a New Testament, a Christian one. And so let's take Marcion's stuff. It's not really that bad, even though Gnostics like it. But let's add some things that will pad it out and sort of sanitize it, establishing male dominance, among other things. And I find that completely persuasive.
Yes.
Of course, you shouldn't take my word for any of this, but her book is just amazing. Another one, what you said about the communities of women being the origin of some of these stories. Great little book on that is by Dennis MacDonald, called The Legend and the Apostle. And he goes into some of the same stuff, but it is really fascinating. And that book is what sparked the idea for my dissertation about the widow traditions in Luke Acts. He is brilliant also. And so there's some great stuff about this, and you're really zeroing in on a lot of important aspects of it.
It's fascinating. I mean, whether you agree or not, the biblical accounts have actually happened in the first place, but they do one thing for sure: they reflect human psyche. Whether these stories might have never happened in the first place, but they still, even if they have not happened, they've happened in the minds of an author who reflected a certain culture, who reflected a certain common understanding, and therefore, even though they might not have happened, they've happened in the minds of so many people, and they became powerful enough to manifest in people's lives today. So whether you're a mythicist or not, I think at this point, it's almost like Jesus' existence is irrelevant.
That's what I think. I remember one night I was watching Saturday Night Live decades ago, and Bob Dylan was the guest host, and he's saying, "You got to save somebody," and he says that maybe God or it may be the devil, but you got to save somebody. And I thought, you know, even if there wasn't a Jesus, I am facing this character in this story who offers a clear path. Do you want to take up the cross and live for these ideals? You can do that whether Jesus existed or not. So it is alive on the page, which is why I'm so in despair over village atheist types to think, oh, it didn't happen. Well, that's a lot of crap. Let's get rid of it. Oh, God,
No, that would be ridiculous. So if this is still written by man, this is our story still. This is the human story. So all these symbolic stories, they still mean something to us. Okay, maybe take away the walking on the water and all these bits and pieces to the garnish, and you're still left with the certain things. You end up with that guy who always stands up for his principles, and you have lots of admiration because he goes, well, I live by my principles and I'm going to do what I believe in regardless of what people think. And sometimes we call this person a fool, but deep down we admire them because they can do something that we can't do most of the time, because we have to
and
become.
they're the ones that leave a mark on history.
Agreed. Because they're authentic. It doesn't, I mean, you could be wrong, but authentic. And that authenticity will still ring true than somebody who's copying and end up being just right just by coincidence, but they're just mimicking others. And you can do something completely authentic and still be wrong. But to me, that experience to me is a lot more valuable than a copied one, because at least you can, I don't have to take that path anymore. Somebody's gone through it and didn't work. That means I don't need to do it again. So they just provide examples and they provide stories. So I think anybody, even atheists like myself, who would read these stories and just plainly laugh at them and dismiss them as stupid, well, that's humanity writing here. So if you take the divine part and you're content with, okay, we are writing we're like almost we're psychoanalyzing ourselves as we go through our stories. And these are the stories that we need to understand in order to know how we used to think in the past. Very, very
That is
important.
exactly what you're doing, as Jung said, because unless the archetypes that are hardwired into the brain are exposed through reading stories and having dreams and all that, you cannot pass on into individuation, as he called it, becoming a real self. That's why there are these songs and epics and scriptures and myths to draw that out of you, to give blueprints and inspirations and so on. It doesn't need to be true. The truth of it is what you live your life as, based on those symbols.
I
Sorry.
completely agree. I mean, facts are facts. You can mention as many facts within 20 minutes as you can, and you can use the same 20 minutes to tell a powerful story. And seems to be so strong in the human learning behavior. If you tell a story that is rich and full of dramas and ups and downs, that seems to influence humans way more than just cold delivered facts that have no connections and no drama, no suspense. I think that's what it is. Religion is so strong and is going to continue because it can tell a story, and that story is wholesome and it's full, lots of holes. It still tells a story. All our fables have lots of holes. I mean, we're talking about token animals for Pete's sake, but we these fables are very important. Our children, behavior and learning certain wisdom. So that's why, unless we start putting the facts that we are arriving at today in a narrative that will appeal to most people, and I've just delivered a lecture as H2O, and this is the equation for quantum mechanics, and they deliver like that, they'll never trump religion. They need to be encapsulated in a story.
Yes, sir.
That's why Carl Sagan, as a science communicator, has excelled, and he's anchored science for the first time as somebody who can tell a story, the story of the stars, the story of the evolution of the cosmos. And that's why Carl Sagan is Carl Sagan.
His supposed successor, Neil deGrasse Tyson, he wound up in a Superman movie, right? Maybe that tells you something. That's going to say something about the universe that just the facts, ma'am, is not going to say.
Yeah. There's a comment here, and I think you did mention critical faculty. I entered this late, but Dr. Price mentioned Tiberius Pantera? That is, I believe, the alleged Roman soldier who supposed to have had sex with Mary.
Yeah, there were people named that, so it's not like a cartoon name or something. But the theory, some people say this doesn't really work in terms of the Greek. I don't know. I don't understand the objection, but it seems to me very likely that it's a pun on Parthenos, virgin. That they're saying, well, it wasn't a virginal conception from the Holy Spirit. It was this guy, Panthera, who impregnated her. Either raped her or seduced her or deceived her, as it has in the Toledot Yeshu, the Jewish anti-gospel, that this guy came to the door knowing Joseph wasn't there, and in the gloom of the night, he claimed he was Joseph. She couldn't tell the difference, and he went to bed with her, and then later, Joseph shows up and says, "Oh, Joe, you're back already. What are you talking about?" And they realize what's happened. This is kind of a non-insulting way of dealing with it, saying you're wrong, but we don't want to make a joke out of it. But that may be where they got the idea of Pandera or Panthera, etc. But who knows? Jim Tabor believes that this story is actually literally true. He's much more conservative than I am about these things. He thinks
Yeah.
they even put the statue of
So
the guy.
Pantera is more like a title, because I think that's sort of Greek or Latin for panther, right? So it's more like a
Yes, that's right.
yeah. It's like a soldier who maybe show like sort of bravery or stealth
Yes.
or yeah. Anything is possible. But remember, we're gonna have to keep one thing in mind here. How old was Mary when this was happening? Some say 11, 12, 13?
Yeah, that's my mother, who died 20 years ago, at age 87, I think. She was born in, I can't even add figures, but I think she was born in like 1916 or 17. And I mean, I'm 68, so we're talking about a long span. She lived in different little towns in rural Mississippi and Tennessee. And she said it was quite common for girls to get married at 12 years old. And it was
Wow.
like when Jerry Lee Lewis was in this scandal because he had married a 12-year-old, and everybody else thought, well, this is child abuse. Well, it's probably a bad idea, but that was a legitimate cultural difference. And that's the way it was often in the ancient world, that
Yeah.
older men would marry very young women, which is why women were treated like children, because they kind of were, because of the age
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah. And I won't call it pedophilia, because people need to understand historical context. And we're talking about the average lifespan is about 40 years. If you get married at the age of 32, like today, you've got very little, married life and time to raise your children. So I can understand starting a little bit earlier in all aspects. So it's completely plausible. I know, and people try to call that pedophilia, and they don't understand what pedophilia
that's a mistake, an understandable one. But
Yeah.
I think that is cultural ignorance or insensitivity.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, I think we've covered lots of points, Bob, and I like to thank you again. I think next episode, I like to tackle maybe 2 or 3 fringe characters from the gospel. I like to cover Joseph of Arimathea, maybe Pontius Pilate, and maybe some other figure. Like if we take 3 figures that sort of lurking about, they're always in the background of the story, whether historical or not, whether why they suddenly appear so out of a sudden to almost to serve certain purpose in the story. Are they real? Have we know anything about them? Because I think shedding some light on those sort of supporting actors in the story might tell us a lot more about the main story itself.
It's always good to look under these rocks.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. All right, folks. Thank you. Hopefully you enjoyed today's episode. In a fortnight again, we'll convene and we'll talk about some other characters from the wonderful gospel that atheists should understand, that it needs to be understood as a literature piece and a reflection of human story and history. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you later.